Alright, hello everyone. I think we're going to get started on the webinar today. Can everybody hear? And does everyone have vision? Okay, so welcome to the webinar. Today our topic is called Using the Delphi Technique in the Study of End-of-Life Care. My name's Nicola and I'm a PhD research student here, and this is my supervisor, Professor Ruth Endacott. Ruth is well versed in Delphi methodology and she's teaching me how to use it for my thesis. Hi Ruth.
Hello there. Hello.
So let's get started with the presentation. So what are end-of-life discussions? For people with advancing serious illness, the future, including treatment and quality of life, are determined by conversations referred to as end-of-life conversations or discussions. These conversations are thought to be particularly important during the last year of life, when death is thought to be imminent, and the way that health professionals know death is imminent is according to documents such as the Gold Standard Framework or the Liverpool Care Pathway that state the treatment guidelines and the indicators of a particular serious illness. These discussions are very important because they determine the quality of life for the patient. So, to begin, we're actually going to start with a question to all of you, and because this seminar is about how to use a Delphi study for looking at end of life, we are going to actually conduct a mini Delphi study during the webinar. So what we'd like you to do is to follow this link that I'm going to post, and I'll post it in the chat box right now as well. And if you could just answer the question that is posted there, which is also here, what do you think might be important during conversation about end-of-life care preferences, and hit submit, and we will follow up on that later in the presentation. I'll post the link now. Nothing.
Okay, so while Nicole is actually posting that into the chat room, just have a few thoughts about what you think might be important during a conversation about end-of-life care preferences. This could be from your perspective as a healthcare professional. It could be maybe related to your own personal experiences. I'm sure we've all got a few of those as well. So just start having some thoughts about those sorts of things that might be considered to be important.
And as Ray mentioned, please make sure you open the link in a separate window of your browser, otherwise you will inadvertently exit the webinar. We don't want you to do that.
So get typing.
So now I'll move on to talk about some topics that might occur in these discussions. And remember that these are just a few topics. You can add any of your responses, any responses that you think of in our little survey. End-of-life conversations can be very distressing for everyone involved because they include topics such as treatment choices and the potential for failure, palliative care, advanced care planning, such things like living wills, if you think that after a certain point you would want to be taken off life support, for instance, you can specify that in the document. Life expectancy, concerns about coping with the illness, goals, anticipatory grief, and philosophic issues such as the meaning of illness and the suffering that results. And however distressing, these discussions are essential in determining the quality of life for the patient involved. I think maybe we'll just pause for a moment and ask if everyone's getting on okay with the survey. Have you been able to enter anything? Okay, we'll move on. So recent research suggests that not all conditions receive equal treatment to end-of-life care. Specifically, a researcher named Partridge and colleagues found that their patients with non-malignant respiratory disease may have had less access to palliative care services than patients with other respiratory diseases, such as lung cancer. These palliative care services that a patient receives are determined by the end-of-life care discussions that the patient has with their health professional, as well as the resources available. So you can see the importance of these discussions, particularly for people with an illness that does not have as many resources allocated as others may. They need to make sure their health professional needs to make sure that they get as many of the resources that are available to ensure their preferences are met. As we said before, these discussions can obviously be difficult for patients, but can also be difficult for family members, carers, and health professionals, as they may not know what to say or how to approach the topic. And they may not have received communication training relating to end-of-life care in their education program, as it's not necessarily a standard requirement. Therefore, our thinking is that a tool that assists health professionals to decide when to approach the topic with a patient may be helpful in solving this problem. It could provide a gateway to palliative care services that can greatly improve the patient's quality of life in their last year. Next, we're going to move on to what is a Delphi. But before I move on, I'd like to ask, and this may be a bit much since you may already be answering the survey, but if not, does anyone know what a Delphi is? And do you have any experience using the method? I'll just wait for a few moments. I think we're on about a 30-second delay for you to write in some answers. So what is a Delphi? Well, the concept of the Delphi actually originated in Greece, as you can see in this picture. In ancient Greece, people used to go to Delphi, the site you see in the picture, to speak to the god Apollo and ask him for advice on their problems. And Apollo spoke through his oracle known as Pythia. The oracle exerted considerable influence throughout the Greek world, and she was consulted before all major undertakings, such as wars, the founding of colonies, and so forth. it was actually thought that the oracle used a number of informants to deliver the truth to people, and her ability to tell the truth was enhanced as a result of receiving data from many sources. And just as a side note, the ruins here at Delphi have been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and you can visit them. So, what happened next was, during the 1950s, the U.S. Air Force sponsored the RAND Corporation, which is a non-profit global think tank to do with policy, funded by the U.S. government, and they funded Project Delphi. Project Delphi was actually established to predict the outcome of a hypothetical Russian nuclear attack on the munitions output of the U.S. Experts in the area were asked to give their anonymous opinion on the probability, frequency, and intensity of possible enemy attacks, and experts gave their anonymous feedback. This process was repeated several times until a consensus emerged. The two researchers, Delphi and Hemmler, wrote a report of the project and their new methodology in 1964, and then submitted it to the Air Force. Their original writings about the project and the method are still available in their original form for free on the RAND Corporation website, and if you're interested, there's a link at the end of the show. So, Delphi and Hemmler devised this methodology based on the notion that it would allow participants to make considered independent opinions leading to reliable conclusions. So you can see the quote they have here is that the technique is seen as a procedure to obtain the most reliable consensus of opinion of a group of experts by a series of intensive questionnaires interspersed with controlled opinion feedback. So now we're going to take a few moments to compile the results of the Delphi, and we'll post the link in a moment. Alright, so Ruth is going to tell you the results of the first round of our Delphi.
Okay, just in that very quick sort of dipping toes in the water of a Delphi, you came out with some interesting responses, and they weren't all the same kinds of responses. Some of the things that you were talking about related to the qualities of the health professional themselves. So in returning the survey back to the experts from whom we're seeking a consensus, we would include things like, to what extent do you feel that the patient has to have confidence in the health professional, in their ability to actually skillfully handle a conversation? To what extent do you agree that the patient has to trust the health professional? We would then have some questions about the detail of the sort of things that should be in those conversations, and one area of questioning would be about practical matters. For example, where does the individual actually want to spend time leading up to their death? What measures do they want to have included to extend their life? and do they have any kind of personal directive or living will regarding what they want to happen to them. Some of you also identified some more philosophical issues around what are their beliefs about pain, so therefore how would they wish to be managed when it comes to looking at pain. And so what we would then do for round 2 is to list all of the responses that the different people have given to round 1 and feed them back to the experts. That then allows the experts to agree or disagree with all of those, and rather than make this rather tedious and type them all in for you, we'll move on to the next stage of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Ruth. So Ray asked in the chat box here, are there other methods of gaining consensus? And yes, there are. I'm not going to be covering those in this presentation, but if you had any questions, you can absolutely email me and we can discuss it. So I'll move on. Why would you use a Delphi? Or why would you want to use a Delphi? You can use a Delphi if you want to collect the judgments of experts in a group decision-making setting, if you want to use qualitative and quantitative methods together. You can use it as one component of your study or use it exclusively as the whole methodology. And so for instance, for my study, based on the results of the Delphi, I will plan the next phase of my project. So the Delphi is a specific mixed method design, and it's called the Sequential Exploratory Design. This type of design involves a phase of qualitative data collection and analysis, as we just did, followed by a phase of quantitative data collection and analysis. The quantitative data collection builds on the qualitative data. And this type of design is recommended for developing an instrument where existing instruments are inadequate or unavailable. The Delphi has 4 key features. They are anonymity of participants, iteration, controlled feedback, and statistical aggregation of group response. I'm using a Delphi in my project because it will allow me to consult with nurse specialists in respiratory disease on my research topic in order to construct the tool that I mentioned earlier, as such a tool does not currently exist. And as I said before, the results will lead to the next phase of my project. So specifically, I'm going to talk about how the Delphi works and how I'm going to use it. My Delphi is going to have 3 rounds. This is an option for the researcher. They can choose 2 to 4 rounds is usually the typical amount. I'm going to conduct it online, as my participants are located across the UK. And I'm going to use SurveyMonkey, as we did for the first round of our mini Delphi during the webinar. And I'm accessing my participants through their employer, the British Lung Foundation. So my first survey in round 1 will collect biographical data as well as answers to 3 open-ended qualitative questions. The biographical data is collected from participants to determine if they fit the expert criteria outlined in the protocol, because ensuring that your participants are expert according to your criteria is essential for the validity of this method. The open-ended questions are designed to encourage participants to provide as many opinions as possible to maximize the chance of covering the most important issues, such as in our mini Delphi here. There was a very wide range of responses, and that is really ideal to just get people thinking in all different directions. So responses will be collected electronically and analyzed using the constant comparative analysis technique outlined by Corbin and Strauss, and the resulting themes and content will be summarized using descriptive and analytic statistics. Nothing very complicated, which is nice. These statistics will be computed to provide participants in round 2 with information about the collected opinions, as Ruth did to you, enabling participants to see where their response stands in the group. Round 2. So a survey will be created with the results of round 2, and in the data collection, participants are given the chance to reconsider their response based on the information presented to them. Participants will be asked to respond to the data quantitatively by rating survey items and stating agreement or disagreement using a Likert type scale. Then data is analyzed again, and statistics are used to produce summaries for each item. Again, this information will be computed to provide participants with information about their collected opinions, allowing participants, again, to see where their response stands in the group. Then in the next round, they'll be given another opportunity to reconsider. So in round 3, the participants will be presented with another survey containing the results of analysis from responses from round 2, and with the statistical information on which items have gained collective agreement. So as in round 2, they'll be given an opportunity to reconsider in response to the group opinion, and they'll be asked to rate the survey items. This data will be analyzed for the researcher to amend the earlier results and look at the areas of consensus. Consensus will be the agreement of 75% of the group, and the items that have consensus will be developed into a tool to be used by health professionals to establish indicators that a patient is ready or willing to discuss end of life. Now, 75% is just a number that I chose from the literature. There isn't really any guidance on what is consensus. It's a decision that you have to make for your own research. The tool will be tested. The tool that comes out of this will be tested and validated in further phases of the study, but that tool obviously depends on this round for development. So, wrapping up, it's easy to see that the Delphi can be a very useful research tool, particularly in healthcare research. In some cases, it could be an alternative to focus groups if your goal is to achieve consensus. And the fact that you can do it online, either in a live format or at the participant's own convenience, adds to its usefulness. In addition, mixed methods are becoming increasingly popular, and it's a great way specifically for research students to familiarize themselves with qualitative and quantitative methodology. So, does anyone have any thoughts, comments, or questions?
While you're all thinking and typing and such like, I'm going to pick up on Ray's earlier comment about other methods of gaining consensus. One of the key methods that is used sometimes to gain consensus is the nominal group technique. Now, with nominal group, you actually have people sort of face to face in a room together, and certainly when I've done this, I've actually been kind of locked in a hotel for 3 days with a group of other ICU clinicians, and it was quite an interesting experience. One of the big challenges with nominal group is that in a way you've got to have people who are not only expert but who are willing to stand their ground and sort of almost stand up and be counted. Because one of the things that you do with Nominal Group is you identify the people who scored something 1 and scored something 10 and get them to explain to the group why they scored it at either end of the particular scale. So in order to avoid everybody just putting their marks in the middle so they don't get picked on to explain their scoring, you do need to have people who are willing to sort of stand up and be counted. It can be quite a useful approach to use, but logistically it's very difficult to manage. It's expensive to do, and it requires physically getting people together. Now, the study that Nicola is doing with the British Lung Foundation includes nurses from Scotland as well as England and Wales, and so the prospect of actually getting all those people together is not great. Some people have tried to do sort of quasi-nominal group work by giving people post-its at a conference and then giving them another post-it an hour later, or so on and so forth. There are all sorts of criticisms of that approach to gaining consensus, not least because you haven't necessarily got experts at a conference. You've got people who are conference goers. They may or may not have expertise in the area. There also may be all sorts of other reasons why people score things the way they do, and you don't necessarily have their attention devoted to the piece of work that you've got in front of them. So there can be all sorts of problems with using that, and certainly to present that as research data and use it to develop a tool in the way that Nicola intends doing would be perhaps quite a shaky premise on which to follow that particular route. So that just gives you a little bit more notion of another way of doing this, which would be Nominal Group. We're just going to have another quick look at some of the other messages now. I don't know whether Nicole's got any response.
Ray, to answer your question about why not use an anonymous discussion board, extract the themes, and then go to rating, I think my answer to that is that I wouldn't be able to ensure that my participants were in fact expert, and I wouldn't have necessarily the same amount of control that I do in this case. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ruth?
Yes, I think the other thing about a focus group is that the whole benefit of doing a focus group is the synergy you get with one person saying something and then another person sort of chipping in and having thoughts triggered. The idea of using Delphi is that everybody is confronted with those initial 3 questions and they think about them individually. So in round 2 you then present back everybody's responses, and then they can either say, oh yes, I agree with that, I just didn't think about it. Or they say, actually, no, that's not my experience, I wouldn't go down that particular route. So it's in a way a more robust means of ensuring that you are getting individual opinions from people and not the collective consensus. One of the problems with consensus always is that you foreclose too quickly and you get the consensus developing too soon, which means that people don't feel they can then disagree. And so particularly for developing an assessment tool, it's important that we don't follow that route.
Mm. And I guess what you say is true, Ray, that they could be known experts to me but remain anonymous. But I guess ultimately it's just not the methodology that I've chosen. I find the Delphi to be very interesting. It has a really great history, and I'm just really interested in trying to use it and see where it takes me. Any other comments or questions or thoughts?
I'm interested, Rashid, part of your PhD looks a bit like a Delphi. Maybe you could just type us a little bit more detail as to why it looks a bit like a Delphi. rooms. Okay, that's an interesting notion. What happens if you don't get convergence? Quite often what will happen in a Delphi is that some things you'll get agreement very early on, so there may be some matters about which everybody completely agrees, and so you can present those back even in round 2 as everybody has said these particular things, so we don't necessarily need to seek greater consensus. With some areas you might then look at the demographic data to see why people are disagreeing. Ali James may wish to come in at this stage, or she may not, because with Ali's Delphi that she's been doing, I know there are some areas in which she has had convergence and some areas where she hasn't, but one step you can certainly take is to look at demographics. Is it about the experience of the person? Although we're targeting experts, expertise comes from different sources, and it may be that some people have worked with a particular patient group and therefore have a leaning in one particular direction. But it is also quite reasonable for items then to drop out of an assessment tool because there wasn't consensus that these are things that are particularly important, and so that's an important part of the tool development.
Oh, so
we're just reading Rashid's response at the moment. Just one moment. Ray, I'm intrigued to know why your picture's suddenly changed from being yourself to somebody that looks a bit more like Chris Evans. Right, yeah.
Well, that sounds a lot like a Delphi. I guess I'm not sure. We don't have a lot of detail, but maybe it's missing the round format. Or so how are you getting expert input? Through questionnaire or correspondence? Why did you find them boring, Ray?
I think Delphi has traditionally been used to develop things like priorities for research, and when you get those kind of things thrown back at you, they can actually get quite tedious. It depends what the Delphi is being used for. I would say that certainly with the study that Ali James has been doing, the fact that she's had such a high response rate even through to round 3 indicates that those participants certainly haven't been bored. And Ali might like to just tell us something briefly about her study. So Rashid, your study sounds really interesting. So it sounds as if you've got a consensus development going on there, but not actually wholly through Delphi. Because it seems like you're then not necessarily keeping the same people. The key with Delphi is that you start with a group of people and you keep those same people all through the 3 rounds, or 3 or 4 rounds. The other thing about Delphi, of course, is that the people who don't respond to round 1 can still be targeted for round 3, even if they didn't sort of respond earlier, because it may be that they just didn't know what to say to the open questions, but when you actually give them something to agree or disagree with, they'll actually come to the party. Or maybe it's just a logistics issue of they just weren't around at that particular time, or their broadband went down, or whatever. I'm sure if we were trying to do a Delphi right now with all the pressures on health professionals with sort of the weather and other various things going on, we probably wouldn't get a very good response. So
No.
So you can actually allow people to join at a later stage if they were originally in your cohort. Right. Oh well done, Ray, for staying the course with your Delphi. And yes, if they're too long, it is tedious. It can be tedious. Yeah.
So for instance, well, who knows, I guess we really on mine will have to make sure to be as concise as possible.
One of the areas that you sometimes or one of the strategies I should say that you sometimes use with Delphi is grouping things together, so putting one stem and then having lots of items grouped together after that stem. So you can use a for example. That means then that you're not actually getting them to rate the individual items, but you're getting them to rate that group of items as to whether that whole group of things is important. And it may be that it's something about sort of pain relief, alternative means of pain relief, and so you could put, for example, the use of acupuncture, the use of reflexology and so on. So you're grouping them as one response, so you're not listing them all individually. So that's just one potential way of improving response by not having it too long and tedious. The other area that of course it is worth mentioning is that when you're using any method as a PhD student, that the output from your PhD is to contribute to knowledge, theory and methods, and it depends at what stage in your PhD the Delphi comes in as to whether it's being used to develop something theoretical, whether you're wanting to take a different stance on Delphi and use it as a contribution to methods, therefore allowing other people to pick up your paper and say, oh, this is a different way of doing it. So exactly what structure you'll use for your Delphi will depend from that point of view, but it's certainly a very useful technique in a PhD when you've actually got enough time to really go through the rounds properly and do all of the analysis.
And actually there's a great article that's been very helpful to me by Skamowski. I think it was from 2006. If you email me I can send you the reference, and it's all about using the Delphi in graduate research and the benefits and really an outline of how to do it. So for any other PhD students out there, it has been a really great resource for me. Right, well, does anyone else have any comments or questions? While we're waiting, I'll just put up the final slide with the link to the RAND Corporation information about the original Delphi and also my email address.
It's interesting that these days you can actually get the original papers from RAND, because when people like me cited these papers donkeys years ago, we had to do a special interlibrary loan to get hold of all sorts of rare papers, whereas these days everything is so much more readily available, and I think Nicole would say it's worth getting on there and seeing what they did.
Absolutely, yes, it's very interesting, and it's very nice to have the original source in your hands. Thanks, Ray.
Okay.
All right, well, I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and again, please do email me if you have any questions or want to discuss. Rashida, I'd love to hear more about your study. Thank you.
Okay. So, safe journey for those of you who are travelling.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.